people like worry about, was AI going to put me out of a job? The world is not going to run out of problems. The world has lots and lots and lots of problems, and it needs entrepreneurial intervention. And so I think, but it has to be a problem that you care about and that you think you have some sort of talent that would make progress against it. And then, after that, just go.
All right, y'all, welcome back today. Hey, I'm pumped. Today on the Necessary Entrepreneur, we're thrilled to welcome Geoffrey A. Moore. That's how significant this conversation is going to be. It's not just Jeff, but he's the author of the seminal book, Crossing the Chasm, a must-read for anyone building a tech company or launching a new product. Geoffrey's advised leaders at Salesforce, Microsoft, and Google, helping them scale, innovate, and avoid the pitfalls of rapid growth. I'm pumped about that portion of the conversation today. He's also the author of Inside the Tornado, Zone to Win, Escape Philosophy, and his latest, The Infinite Staircase, where he explores strategy, leadership, and meaning in life. Geoffrey, we're excited to hear your insights for entrepreneurs navigating disruption today, so welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Fire away.
I was telling you the story about the title of the podcast, The Necessary Entrepreneur, and you said, we can call this the involuntary entrepreneur. So I said, hold up, let's tell the story. So why is that fitting for your experience here?
Well, I've had a couple of, I guess we call them pivots these days in my career, neither of which did I initiate. So the first pivot was I educated as an English professor. I have a PhD in medieval English literature, valuable in high tech, as you can imagine. So I got a job at Olivet College in Olivet, Michigan. We were a family of three. Marie and I had 3 kids, and she's from California. We met. I went to Stanford. She was from Palo Alto. We met out here, and we were in Michigan. But every summer we went back to the West Coast. It was kind of clear that we really belonged on the West Coast, and I was not going to be able to get a job in academics there. So the first pivot was kind of just like, we need to move. We need to move back. So we did. And I got a job in a software company. I knew nothing about software, but they hired me as a training director. And I kind of found my way around, and I eventually found my way into sales because I kind of like to talk to people. I'm good at presenting, but I wasn't very good at closing. I was really good at opening, but not so good at closing. So then I got into marketing. I was like, oh, well, yeah, this works for me pretty well. And the second pivot was I was at a startup, and on a Saturday, we found out that the company was going to close its doors on a Monday. And my eldest daughter was going to college in 2 weeks. I thought, I should probably earn some money here. So by that time, I'd been in the Valley for, about 10 years. And so I knew a bunch of people. And I called them up and I say, well, did you have something on your plate that you're not getting done? Maybe $2,000-$3,000. I would just kind of take it off your plate. And after about 6 weeks, I'd made like $15,000. And I mean, this was the time I was making $80,000 a year. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. And at that point, a company called Regis McKenna, which was the premier consulting firm in high tech at the time, and I'd been a client of theirs in the past, they were recruiting for somebody. And I thought, well, okay. So I joined Regis. Now I'm 40 years old. And I get there, and the positioning, it's all about positioning strategy. That was kind of the key to the whole firm. How do you position these disruptive innovations in your company? And about the third week there, I'm looking around going, I think I can do this better than anybody here. I mean, it was like all of a sudden, it was like everything that I'd ever done was sort of like, boom. And then the last pivot was just about 4 years into Regis. They'd taken an investment from KPMG, Pete Marwick, and the investors had said, they're a consulting firm, right? And they said, we'd like to see your work papers, your manuals. Well, there weren't any manuals. Mm-hmm. And so one of the partners was lamenting to me about that. So I thought, let's write a manual. So I thought, okay, I'll write a manual. I like to write. And so I wrote this thing that I thought was the manual for what we were doing. And I showed it to the partners. I said, how about this? And they said, one of the partners took me aside and said, Geoffrey, we came here to work for Regis, not for you. And I went, oh. I said, so this is mine? And they said, yeah, yeah, yeah. I said, could we just like write that down? So we did. And then I took that manuscript to a book editor, to a book agent, and the agent said, well, he said, it's kind of a manual. He said, maybe we could pick there's a chapter called Crossing the Chasm, looks pretty interesting. Why don't we just make that into a book? Okay, make that into a book. Well, that book was what was able to launch everything. That book came out originally in 1990 or 91. It's sold over 2 million copies since then. It's been translated to 12 languages. It just turned out to be a very, very, people call it the Bible, which I think is a little bit sacrilegious. But
so what is, so give us the context of what's the chasm? What chasm are we crossing?
Yeah. So when you introduce a high-tech disruptive innovation like AI right now, everybody's talking about AI. Look, the early adopters go, this is cool, let's do it, let's go. But the mainstream market's going, well, maybe, but let's wait for prime time and see how it's going. So what would happen in tech, and this happened at Regis over and over again, you get this incredible early wave of enthusiasm and big sales, and you get on the cover of Time magazine, whatever, anything amazing. And then there'd be this lull. And the problem was people were staffing up and ramping up and taking extra money, and sales were going down, not up. And the problem was pragmatic people were saying, well, I just don't see enough there. So there's a chasm was between the early market and the mainstream market. And the key to crossing it was simply to say, look, you need to get a niche of customers on the other side active first, kind of like kindling before you light the bonfire. And who would be the kindling? It would be people who are struggling with something. They've tried everything and nothing's working. They're about to get fired probably, or their process is really hanging people up. And you come along and say, okay, look, with our technology and some extra work, and if we focus just on your problem, we can take this problem off the table. And so that was the Crossing the Chasm playbook. And so the book was just simply, how do you actually do that?
Which is exactly what you did at 40 years old.
Yeah,
for that company that said yes.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so but the key to it is it's got to be repeatable. So the key to the mainstream market that I don't think we appreciated enough until I think I wrote the book was, this is a word of mouth market. If you do it and you do it and you do it, I'll do it. But until I see the three of you guys doing it, and you got to be my peers, you got to be people I trust, I'm going to probably hesitate. And so the reason you go after the people, we call them pragmatists in pain, is you want to find a use case that everybody in that industry is struggling with the same problem. So you get the first one, that's hard to get you. The second one, a little easier. But the fifth time, everybody who has that problem starts coming to you. So the original story was a company that had written a document database where anybody in the world could use it, right? Boeing could use it, and pharmaceuticals could use it. But the pharmaceutical guy was using it to get through the new drug approval process a lot faster. Turns out every day that you have a drug in the approval process is a day of patent life you lose. And a patent life is worth about $1 million a day. So, when you're losing 6 months, people notice, right? And so that was but the point was, we had one customer. That's how we learned about the problem. And that was just consulting to this company. And then we got a second and a third. That was hard to do. By the fifth, word was out. And 18 months later, we had 30 of the top 40 pharmaceutical companies had committed to the technology and then the word was, oh yeah, this company documented, they just do pharma. Well, but then we branched out and we got into to the legal guys, and we got into the oil and gas guys, and it just kept spreading. But that was the Crossing the Chasm playbook. Get on the other side, and then land and expand is what you'd probably call it nowadays.
Think about you now being the author about copyright now with AI.
Well, so for me, by the way, as far as I was concerned, I wanted everybody and his mother to read this thing, and I didn't care if I got a nickel for it.
So it's like an open patent. It's like I wrote it, but everybody can use it.
Yeah, it's as I said it, because we started a group after a while, the Chasm group. But anyway, there were a bunch of us. People said we should patent this, or we should trademark this, and I said no. Every time anybody says the word chasm, we win.
There you go.
And so that's kind of how we played it.
It's a growth mindset, right?
Yeah, totally. And a service mindset. I think the other thing that I think is people kind of lose, they're saying, well, I don't know if I really like the entrepreneurial vibe these days. if it's too self-serving, if it's too much about get rich quick, if it's too much about, I'm going to be the macho bro, whatever that stuff is, none of that plays as well as to say, no, I mean, Steve Jobs was probably the best at, I want to change the world. I want to make the world a better place. And every product that Steve ever made was designed to try to make the world a better place. And so that as a result, people leaned in because, yeah, let's make the world a better place, as opposed to let's just make you rich.
Why do you think, coming from Michigan, when you said you wouldn't have been able to get a teaching job, why wouldn't you have been able to go back to California and get that?
Because in academics, there weren't any jobs. When I applied for the college, so let me give you the example. I got my job in 1974 at Olivet College, a college of 800 students. That year, they had 400 applicants for my job. So, you say I won or I lost, either way. The point is, and so when I knew when it coming back, there just weren't any jobs at that time. But I'd heard about Silicon Valley. I thought, well, and I went to Stanford. I thought, Stanford's got a placement thing. I mean, we got to find something. And so it was like, yeah, let's just go do it.
How did Silicon Valley, because is it a chicken or an egg thing? Was Stanford there with the minds to feed Silicon Valley, or did Silicon Valley start and then Stanford was just there in the vicinity, and that's where which one is it?
Yeah, it's a great story. I think there was a cultural thing. At Stanford, there was a guy, an engineering professor in the 30s and 40s named Fred Terman, and Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard. Bill Hewlett, maybe they both were in this class, but anyway, and he had that entrepreneurial kind of spirit that very much. He was a necessary entrepreneur, and Dave and Bill did too, and they created Hewlett Packard, and then there was a bunch of defense contracts at that time, and the semiconductor industry was there, so there was the beginning of something kind of interesting, and then the venture capital started to form. So it's like this quietly forming ecosystem, and at the time it was so hard to invest in tech because everybody who wanted to invest, first of all, you wanted a loan, you had to have collateral. Well, nobody had any collateral, and it was software. What are you going to do? And so this venture investing thing came about. And so the venture investing and the PR firm, Regis McKenna's PR firm, that was part of the ecosystem. And after a while, the ecosystem was basically all by itself. There was no other ecosystem like it in the world for at least a decade. Then all of a sudden, there was going to be Silicon Valley, Silicon Desert, and Silicon City, and Silicon this and Silicon that. But by that time, and you can't just. The ecosystem grows organically, but once it's grown, it's just extremely difficult to replicate. And so that's why I think a lot of success.
How did Microsoft come out of Seattle then? Was it because that's just where Bill Gates and Ballmer and those guys were?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that Seattle was a secondary ecosystem, and Bill was an extraordinary, well, obviously he was an extraordinary entrepreneur, but then Bill also had how did he cross the chasm? Well, when IBM essentially installed Bill in every computer that they sold. So he didn't have to cross the chasm. He was like airlifted across the chasm. But he was smart enough to understand that, that was his asset. And then he was able to get compact computer to do a PC compatible. Nobody'd ever heard of that before. But that looked like a good idea. And then he was off to the races.
What do we take from, massive respect for these people who have built these huge companies. We talk about their personality traits, and the books about Steve Jobs and Musk and Bill Gates, and they weren't the nicest at times. But the fascinating thing is that this isn't taking anything from Bill Gates and how brilliant he was, but Word was pretty much a new iteration of WordPad, wasn't it?
Yeah. Everything that Microsoft ever did was fast follower. So they did. First of all, the operating system they actually got from Seattle operating system. Then WordPerfect was the standard. Lotus was the standard. Now it's Excel. Altus Persuasion was the presentation. Now it's PowerPoint. Netscape Navigator was the browser that it became Internet Explorer. I mean, Bill was but they were relentless fast followers, and they just, whereas most of the first founders had a little bit more spirit, a little bit more flair, but they weren't this relentlessly competitive institution. And so in the 90s, one of the interesting things about the culture of tech, in the 90s, it was an incredibly competitive culture. I mean, it was like every executive, give me my objectives, give me my resources, and get the hell out of my way, you know. But it's interesting as we moved into this century, as the tech started talking to each other, as we had, Google. If you think about Google, where did all their resources come from? Well, they came from the World Wide Web, and you had to have application programming interfaces, and so can talk to so and so. And all of a sudden, you did a search, and a map showed up. Well, where did the map come from? Well, it came from Yahoo. So all this stuff. And what happened was you had to go from being competitive to being more collaborative. So if you look at like the leader of Microsoft today, Satya is a collaborator. Okay, Mark Benioff is very competitive, but he's a collaborator. And you look at the guy who's running Uber now as a collaborator.
What about Oracle? Are they collaborative? Is he collaborative, Oracle?
No.
It seems like he wants to run over everyone.
No. Larry was the ultimate competitor. The ultimate competitor. And all the guys. I mean, the Scott McNeely at the Sun, and John Chambers was pretty darn competitive. He was a nice guy, but he's a very competitive guy at Cisco. And Andy Grove was pretty competitive at Intel. And all these people will kind of take no prisoners. I mean, like, just take no prisoners. But if you talk to people today, particularly young people, that's not what they want. They want to have their life have, a bigger dimension than just raising the stock price.
That's the new book. Do you think you read the tea leaves on what was happening in society, or is this a place you came to as well with this infinite staircase? Because what it does, it moves into philosophy, ethics, the pursuit of meaning. How'd your mind get there? Was it reading society?
Well, first of all, age.
Yeah, you're still functioning pretty well here.
A little bit aging thing is happening. But, I said my doctorate was in medieval English literature, which is in literature in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It was halfway between literature and philosophy all the time anyway. So I always had that sort of interest. And then I also kind of got a Kindle maybe 20 years ago. Well, one of the things about Kindle is first of all, if you put it in dark mode, you can read in your bed at night and not wake your wife, which is a wonderful thing. But then you want to go back to sleep. The problem is if you're reading a really exciting book, you don't go back to sleep. So I started reading philosophy instead. and science. So I read about Darwinism. I read about this. And the more I read about it, it started actually with the science stuff, the Darwinism and then the molecular biology of the cell. And you think, what in the world? How is this possible? And I realized that there was this whole story about how creation happened from the Big Bang to Mark and Jeff talking on, the Necessary Entrepreneur podcast. If you say there's no divine invention, if you say, look, I want to build the secular version of this story, no offense to anybody who wants a different story, but if you just wanted to build a story that was based on secular, how could you get from the Big Bang to the present without interventions? And it turns out there was quite a material, but it had to be pieced together. So the first 2/3 of that book is just saying, I'm going to tell you, and by the way, it's based on this idea of emergence and complexity. The Santa Fe Institute did a wonderful job of explaining that to me. But it's the idea of each layer of reality builds on the prior layer. Without that prior layer, you couldn't have it, but it also has its own identity. So yeah, there's physics, chemistry. Obviously, you can't have chemistry without physics. But
isn't that the way we learn everything, though? Everything compounds.
Yes. Yeah. It's emergent. But this is the idea now. This is the structure of reality, which is. Not everybody would agree with that. So, but the structure of reality is built in layers. The book goes through 11 of these layers. And the idea was I got from the Big Bang to here. But then the last third of the book was, okay, so what does that say about ethics? So because ethics was traditionally based on divine intervention, right? You got to get along with God. Well, what if there's no God? If you just take that as a premise of the story, now what? And so the last third was about how would you build ethics in that world? And that's become, back to Silicon Valley, that's become an increasingly important issue in the tech world. I think people are increasingly concerned about the ethics of AI, the sustainability. I mean, a number of things like that. So you want to have a foundation for it. And so when somebody tries to run roughshod over your ethics, you have a way of saying, no, I'm going to stand up.
What do you think about AI? And here's what's funny. You being in the tech space, this has been the reality of systems for at least a decade for people behind the scenes, right? So
what's new? Yeah. It's actually it's radically new, and it's kind of important to understand why. We've had what we call predictive AI virtually since I joined tech in the 80s, because we were doing statistical quality control, we were predicting failures, we were doing all kinds of things. I think the thing that just absolutely blew people away was this thing they call generative AI, was the chat GPT stuff, where for the first time you were having a conversational interface with a computer. Not the GUI was wonderful. By the way, God bless the Macintosh, God bless the iPhone, but you still had to understand how a GUI worked. You still had to understand how an iPhone worked. When you did chat B2, it's just the button says, ask me anything. So you start and you start talking and you have this remarkable experience of if I just keep talking and keep refining my questions and keep pushing back, I get better and better and better answers. When I did my research for a PhD, I had to go to a library and I had to go to a place called the Stacks, and you had to sort of find this stuff and pull it off the shelves. No, it's right there. So that was amazing number one. And then the amazing number two, which is happening now, is they call agentic AI. And that is, well, if you look at if you look at all the data that's available, and they have this monster amount of data that's coming in, you can actually train computer systems to analyze x-rays better than radiologists, to analyze stock options better than Wall Street analysts, to analyze, to do whatever it is. And so I think agentic AI is the one that I think has got people still a little bit deer in the headlights, because it's so powerful. You're thinking, this is like letting the genie out of the bottle. We have to be a little thoughtful here. But the generative AI, which is the one for language, what they call the large language modules, that one, anybody who plays with that thing goes, wow. I mean, you point out, artists and authors are actually upset because they feel like they're being displaced, and because
it's a new market now, I guess, right? It's a new market.
It's a new world, and the truth of the matter is, how did they get displaced? Because at the time we said if it's on the web, it's fair use. Anybody and anybody can read it, right? Well, it didn't occur to somebody would invent a system that read all of it. And in fact, when they said that we're going to download, the first people that said we're going to download the web was Google, which I thought was like the dumbest idea I'd ever heard, because I'm so smart. But at the time, it's like, what? But now it's like the web's too small. No, we're gonna suck everything out of everything. And so by the time people figured out what that actually translated into, it was too late.
Yeah, then the horse is out of the barn, right?
Exactly.
So what does this do with your brain of you being an eternal? You're a person of an eternal educated mind. You get a PhD in literature. This is going to transform the way we educate ourselves, is it not?
Yeah, it is. And I think the key thing is going to be how we play off. There are two pieces that I think that are so important in education. And in the book, the two layers I talk about are narrative and analytics. So narrative is the stories we tell each other to guide our lives, the stories that you recount on this podcast time after time after time. And people hear the stories, and it's how we get involved. It's how we get engaged. You can even think of your own personality as kind of like a character in a story or in a novel, and what I want to act out this way because I think that's the way my character should act and do it. And that's kind of the power of narrative. And then the analytics is the checkpoint on that, which is like, well, okay, but I mean, Geoffrey, let's really be real here. What are you actually doing? What are the actual consequences? What are you doing? Could you do it better? Where might you be more useful, et cetera? And so if you look at education now, I think the artificial intelligence stuff is giving an enormous amount of boost to analytics. Certainly it's giving you information for analytics. It also gives you access to narratives, but I think the narratives you get are less interesting than the analytics. The narratives tend to be a summary of all the narratives that you've kind of already heard before. And so it's like, okay, yeah, that sort of sounds right. But the analytics are interesting because it can expose you to analytics that I don't know that stuff. And it does.
If you would go back now, if you were going through a PhD again, do you think you would cut down the amount of time? I think that's the question in education now is it necessary to take these extended 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 year periods when all this information is already put together and you could study it differently now? Is it going to look different now?
It's really interesting because, we talk about college education, but I don't know about when you went to college, classroom was not the most important thing that happened to me. right? I mean, college education was a lot about, meeting other people, having these conversations. I went to Stanford, had a campus in Italy. I was there for 1 year. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that even at the PhD level, again, you have these dialogues or questions or whatever. And so I think that's the thing that takes time as opposed to doing, anything you could do to accelerate grunt work. We should try to take the grunt work off the table. But the topic areas, are existentially challenging. And so and it takes time for a human being to get their head around something that's existentially challenging. That's kind of what we're meant to do in a way, but you can't, that's hard to accelerate. But accelerating, getting the information in, that's really, really worth doing.
Yeah. Would it have benefited you to go through the process of obtaining your PhD? Would it have benefited you to shorten that, to then spend more time compounding and growing in other educational ways? Because that's what we're sitting here talking about. Or would you still, again, want to take the same amount of time? So not anybody else, not students of today. Would you, if you had the ability to, would you shorten the time frame?
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny. If I knew where I was going, yes. To be fair, even when I was doing my PhD, it was like I wasn't quite sure what I was going to be about. And so I think that the fact that there was a pace there was fine. I think what's important is, I think where time starts becoming valuable is when you start aligning your personal energy with an outcome that's beyond you. And so you're saying, I now need to have impact. And so impact, I think, is where you start valuing your time more. Prior to impact, I'm having fun. It's good. We'll just do stuff. And I mean, you think about college kids, I think there's a time when you should just enjoy it. But at some point in your life, you say no. Well, and not everybody, but certainly everybody on this podcast of the entrepreneurial spirit says, no, I'm only going to be on this planet for a while. I do want to get something done. And now time becomes very valuable.
Yeah. What impact do you think you've made? Like, that's not just a throwaway question. I'm sitting here wondering, do you reflect on that? You still have more to do. Now you engaged with your age earlier and all that, but I can still see it with your mind and your energy. You still have a lot that you're doing. Like, you're still very, very engaged, but
well, yeah, and what's cool about, by the way, one of the good effects of COVID, which had many bad effects, was we all got online. We got the Zoom effect. So all of us at this point, at the time that COVID hit, I was at a point where you say, well, you should be retiring, and my practice doubled because all of a sudden I could, instead of having to say, well, I'll fly out and meet with your team on Tuesday and we'll do a workshop on Wednesday, whatever. It's like, no, 10 to 12, let's do a little thing over Zoom. And it was boom. So that was very exciting. So I think the ability to have impact, and my card says author, speaker, advisor, and that's kind of what I do. So I either write stuff or I give talks or I do advisory stuff. So with this medium is magnificent for that. And I sort of feel like one of those aging quarterbacks that's saying, like, Tom Brady, why in the world are you getting off? Why don't you get off the football field? It's like, because I like to play the game.
There's nothing else that you want to do more than this.
Totally. That's absolutely true. Absolutely true.
What when you're sitting down advising now, where do you find yourself most satisfied and you feel like you're really, really giving value back? When you enter a situation, what's that look like? You're like, this is right up my alley. My brain's processing this. I really know how to advise.
Or by the way, let me give you the opposite too, which is like, where do I go? Oops. And it has a lot to do with the character and integrity of this. I typically now start most of my relationships are with CEOs and their teams. And then what's really cool is when they get deep, their teams. So, I mean, I'll know 30 or 40 or 50 people in the company, not just the top execs. That's wonderful because at that point you really do kind of, the middle of the organization always knows stuff that the top never really gets and vice versa. So it's really, and I'm sort of this free agent that gets to sort of go up and down as I choose. I think the way the winning relationships, there has to be trust, and you have to care. I mean, I think part of the reason that I've been able to have some success is because people kind of know, well, I don't know if he's right or wrong, but obviously he cares. And I'm not trying to flog an agenda. I'm not trying to say, well, you need to follow my thing. I think the whole idea of being intellectually curious, and you think about how a literature seminar works. The purpose of a literature seminar is not to teach you what I think about Moby Dick. It's to help you find out what you think about Moby Dick. And that's kind of the way the practice works too. It's the same way.
Is when you come in an advisory situation, they're not just coming in to sing Kumbaya and you to celebrate with them. Is it all around we're trying to grow? Is that pretty much what it comes down to?
Well, we're trying to do something that we're not having success. And so usually what'll happen is I will give a talk, or they will read a book, or they will read a blog or something, and they go, "Oh, maybe that's why we're not having success." So the latest business book was called Zone to Win. And Zone to Win, it was like Crossing the Chasm for adults, meaning Crossing the Chasm was written for entrepreneurial companies that are startups that are trying to break into the market. Zone to Win was written for Salesforce and Microsoft. I mean, so it's like, but the problem they were having was, how do I do it again and again and again? Because and this is what Clay Christensen was so eloquent about, once you become an established enterprise, you become your own enemy in a sense. You become your own gravitational field. We have many Intel currently is suffering from the hangover of that problem. So how could you manage your enterprise in a way that allowed you to both honor your existing business, which needs organic growth and investment, and participate in the next wave, which needs enormous investment that's going to create a smoking crater for a while. And by the way, you're a public company and your shareholders aren't really crazy about that. So how would you do that? And it was Satya Nadella's team at Microsoft and Mark Benioff's team at Salesforce. By the way, if you want to write a book, sit down with really good teams. Just bring your pen and write it down. But we kind of came up with an approach of how that would look like. And that, I think, has been over the last 5 years. That's the thing I've been spending the most time with, is how do you install that zone management system, and how would you make it work?
Can the same groups do the same thing, or does that have to be a new team? Does that have to be a separate team that's operating the business versus, because that it doesn't seem like, I don't know if those bubbles go together.
No, but there are 4 zones. The zones were the performance zone, which is where the people that are making it today and the people that are selling it today, that's the performance zone. That's where the money's coming from. That's what the shareholders are seeing. That's what the analysts are writing about. God bless. Underneath it is something we call the productivity zone, which is all the shared services, cost centers you need to run a performance zone at scale. And there's typically more people in that zone, actually, even in the performance zone, because you got legal and IT and global and finance and HR and facilities and purchasing and you name it. But
the fourth zone.
Well, wait, that time, those are the first 2.
Okay.
Performance and productivity. That's like 90% of your budget in any given year is probably there. Then we had the incubation zone. Well, that was the one. Okay, so people were hearing about incubation. And the interesting thing about incubation, I spent 25 years of my life as a venture partner in venture firms. So I kind of knew how the venture model worked. And the venture model is designed to run an incubation zone. That's kind of what it does for a living. But it turns out nobody in enterprise was using that model. And it was like, what the hell? What are you guys talking about? And they were coming up with their own theory. They had the entrepreneur this and the blah, blah, that. And it was just baloney. It was like, no, people, you need to hold this group accountable the way venture holds people accountable. They weren't. And the budgeting process didn't work that way. And the compensation didn't work. I mean, it was just wrong. So we said, okay, what would that look like? But then it turned out the really problem was the 4th zone, called the transformation zone. And that was the one was saying, okay, we're either going to go big or go home. And the problem is when you're in the public market and you say you're going to go big, your shareholders get really, really cranky. So now all of a sudden, now if you're Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or Larry Ellison or Bill, at some point, I remember Jeff Bezos saying, if you don't like my approach, sell my stock. I mean, you can do that. But most CEOs are not founders. Most CEOs are hired CEOs. The board said, we're hiring you, among other things, to manage for shareholder value. We want the stock price to go up. And so you're going, well, actually, the stock price is going to go down. And it's like there's a little disconnect. And so the thing that we learned about that, the takeaway line, this would be good for some of the people, if you're entrepreneurs or in larger companies. Everybody gets that a transformation will take more than 1 year, and nobody will give you 3. So when you say I'm going to transform, well, that means at the end of the 8th quarter, you don't have to be all the way but you have to be on a trajectory that people say, I want to be on that bus. That bus is going someplace. You do not get a 9th quarter going down. You have to turn the corner and be going up. Well, what was happening was people would start and they get into the thing and they get to their fourth or fifth quarter and things were struggling and it wasn't getting quite that priority. And the VP of sales said, well, do you want me to make my number or do you want me to work on this? Well, you got to make your number. And so they would kind of take their foot a little bit off the gas and they sort of, it just doesn't work. That if you're going to transform, it has to be job one for everybody in the company. Because by the way, if it is job one for everybody in the company, you can do it in 8 quarters. In fact, you can almost certainly do it in 8 quarters. The problem is getting it to be job one for everybody in the company.
And how's that look for preservation of cash flow?
Well, the thing about cash, if you say, look, I'm going to model the cash flow thing. I'm going to take a big hit. So sometimes Michael Dell had to take his company private at one point. There are people that say, look, I got to go private in order to make this turn because the public markets are really not designed to take venture risk, nor should they be. And so when you say I'm going to do this, now, you know, but you don't have to go private. But what you do have to do is have a narrative, and the narrative has got to be super compelling. Like, look, I mean, look at IBM. Lou Gerstner at IBM would be a good example. His narrative was, we went from making $7 billion a year to losing $8 billion the next year. So there's a shift changing from hardware to software and services, and I'm going to take this company from a hardware company to a software and services company. And he did it. I mean, that was the narrative. And people, and by the way, IBM kind of cleared the table in the 90s. IBM had the best hand at the table in the year 2000. It just didn't. But the next leadership said, I'm going to optimize for financial returns. And as soon as you're running your company for financial returns, you're now in an aging cycle. And it's very, very hard. As Nokia showed us, as Intel is showing us right now, it's very, very hard to come back.
As BlackBerry showed us?
As BlackBerry shows, all the Sun Microsystems, Silicon Graphics. I mean, you know, wonderful, wonderful companies. I mean, I would argue HP struggling, both, they're not struggling, but the point is that both times they ended up saying, my shareholders are my number one priority. That's just a mistake. Your shareholders do not care about you. You are a financial instrument in their portfolio.
How do you think Bezos? How do you think he pulled off convincing people it was about the value of the stock?
Well, I think he did. I think what Bezos just said is, I'm re-engineering the world. And well, first of all, he proved his track record. So he said, I'm going to make the internet work for books. And all of a sudden, Barnes and Noble and Borders. Well, Borders was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, was the original Borders. We used to drive from Olivet 4 hours to go to that bookstore. So that was, and Barnes and Noble, followed suit. And Bezos said, well, I'm going to do this over the internet. And then it was like, well, it's only 1% of sales. Well, it's only 2% of sales. Well, it's only 4% of sales. This exponential thing. And all of a sudden, we don't have any Borders and Barnes and Nobles anymore. Yeah. So he did it with that. The thing that I think was just, and then he went into retail and he thought, oh, no, that's not going to work either. But then it was like, well, yes, it is. But then the next one was Amazon Web Services for computing. And that was like, I mean, that was clearly IBM's job. IBM was going to be cloud computing. And it was like, these guys just came out of nowhere and they just did it in a way that was, he took Bezos is a genius of taking friction out of any process. I mean, like a genius. And they're relentless about it. They just don't stop. And like the latest one is Prime. I don't know if you're a member of Amazon Prime.
I am. How are you not? Why
don't we just send our paychecks to Amazon and be done? I mean, because why wouldn't you? Yeah.
The convenience the convenience they've added into our lives. Regardless if we love it or not, and you know what Walmart did with small town, whatever. If you bring convenience to consumers' lives, we pay money for it, and you're
taking friction out of the system.
That's it.
And they're brilliant at taking friction out of the system. So, and I think that's a lesson we can all learn. So, in where we are, and we're serving our customers, we always export a certain part of our task load to the customer. But the customer doesn't want it, but they live with it because I will drive to Safeway. Safeway's not going to drive to me. Oh, Amazon will drive to me? Oh, I mean, it's that kind of thing. So I think the lesson for us to learn there is wherever there's trapped value, that's where the entrepreneur should be focused.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you like these types of conversations, be sure to follow The Necessary Entrepreneur on your favorite platform so you never miss out on future content. What do you mean by that, about trapped value?
Well, so every system that enables, like, take Walmart. Walmart, or just take retail, brick and mortar retail. Brick and mortar retail is an amazing thing. It enables an incredible amount of commerce. You can see goods, you can try things on, you can return things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it's a system, but there's trap value in the system. They have to carry a lot of inventory that they're never going to be able. They have to sell eventually some other way. You have to get there and come back, and you have to make time in your day to do that. And if you have children or whatever, that may or may not be a challenge. So there's trap value in the system. So what Prime did is it said, we're going to take that trap value out of the system. And so that was amazing. Uber, look, I don't know if you were ever in pre-Uber, but if you ever tried to get a taxi in your town, you'd call a dispatcher. You didn't even know if the taxi was going to come.
All the movies where everybody's standing on the corner raising their hand.
Yeah, they doing that now. So Travis figured out, well, if we've got all these people with cars and we've got all these people that want rides, so maybe we do. And so and then Brian did the same thing with Airbnb. You got a spare bedroom and people want a place to stay. And so these are trap values. These are places where value is trapped. And I would make the claim that every technology investment ultimately is paid for by releasing trap value.
To your medieval literature, what time frame are we talking about? Are we talking the 1500s? What are we talking about?
Okay, well, my dissertation was actually right at the cusp between the Middle Ages and Renaissance. A guy named Edmund Spenser, he was a contemporary of Shakespeare. And he wrote a poem called The Faerie Queen, which about 7 people might have read, maybe 8 by now. I don't know. But at the time, it was a big deal. But it was long in the tooth when I was studying, and I think it's even longer now. But the point was, the book was really, the subtitle of the book was Strategies for Living in The Faerie Queen. And so the strategy thing, that's been there from the beginning. And the insight about strategy was just, before you pick your tactical move, you got to have some understanding of the situation. So understand the situation. That's the first 2/3 of Infinite Staircase. What's the situation? The last third is, what are you going to do about it? And that was, by the way, I was looking at literature, saying literature gives you examples of strategies for living. Every hero, Elizabeth and Darcy in Power and Pulp, Pride and Prejudice, they have a strategy for living, and everybody has a strategy. Harry Potter has a strategy for living, and so does Voldemort. Voldemort has a strategy for living. So what are the strategies, and how do you? And so the strategy was the thing. That's why when I got to Regis, I thought, oh, I can do this, because it basically was all narratives about strategy, and I've been doing that that was my whole academic career.
Do you think we're still the same? I go back to meditations like Marcus Aurelius, and do you think that those are all his exact quotes and statements?
Well, I don't know if I think that the philosophy of Stoicism was sort of saying, look, one of the ways to deal with the vulnerability of human experience is to protect yourself by essentially withdrawing your consent from it. Buddhism would ask you to do a similar thing, right? I'm not a fan of that at all. I happen to be in the transcendental meditation side. When the Maharishi came around with the Beatles and whatever, I got on that train, and that was so I've been meditating for 55 years or something like that. And so I have a more optimistic view of it. But the point was, but Marcus really still resonates with people. I mean, you go, yeah, no.
So that's what I'm wondering is, are we just repeating this human experience, versus layering the 11 layers? And are we learning more, or is every human just already learning the same thing that they were learning 600 years ago?
I think it's a little. There are some lessons that are more lasting. I think the thing that makes human life so strange or so adventurous is the hand that we were dealt today is so different from the hand that was. I mean, Marcus Aurelius had a pretty good time. He and about 10 other people did. Everybody else in that world was just had a
miserable.
really, really, really. And the average life expectancy was 35 years. So so it's I think the hand we've been dealt right now, particularly in this country, has been extraordinary. Now, by the way, I think we're not playing that hand as well as we should be, but we've been dealt a hell of a hand. I hope we can protect it and preserve it and respect it, because right now we're not being as respectful of our traditions as we need to be. And so I am concerned about that.
All of us are born into a way better environment than even the 10 people that had the best lives during Marcus Aurelius' time. It's incredible.
Totally true. Yeah,
it's incredible.
Yeah. And so I was raised in a family that said, if you are gifted with something, that just means you have to give back more. So the more gifted you've been, the more you better give back. That's sort of the way to.
Who taught you that? Where'd that come from?
My parents and grandparents. Yeah. It was just a values. It was just like, because otherwise you go, well, I've got all this cool stuff, and that must mean I'm a really cool person. It's like, no, you're not as cool as you think you are.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure at times in your life you thought you were pretty cool.
And those are, boy, talk about the times when I made my biggest mistakes. All of them were built right on top of that.
Yeah. What do we do with ego? That's the bad part of ego, but I don't think all ego is bad.
There's a chapter in the book called Honoring the Ego, because the point is, and the point I wanted to say that is, look, the ego has to actually take responsibility for everything you do. And it doesn't know what it's doing. It's just making it up as it goes along. So yeah, it makes mistakes, but it's like, guys, I mean, it's the athlete on the playing field. So yeah, the coach could have said we should have called a different play, or so-and-so shouldn't have, should have blocked that thing. But this is the guy on the playing field. So have some respect for the fact that we're playing the game together. And then I think the other thing I would say about the ego is it's a terrible master and it's a wonderful servant. So when you're trying to satisfy your ego as a master, it just sucks. But if you put your ego in service to something that you care about, it's terrific. And in fact, the ego is happiest, I think, when it's just being in service and having an impact.
Why do you think that? Have you learned it from the way you feel in your experience? What you see?
It's certainly the way my psyche is constructed. And when I see people who have the opposite kind of ego, the ego that's based on making other people small, in other words, it just doesn't feel. And by the way, nobody else likes them. I mean, if you want to have impact, there's that whole African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. If you want to have impact, you got to go far. And if you got to go far, others have to come with you. Well, others aren't going to come with you unless you and they are in service to a common cause that you both are inspired to serve. And that's why else would they come with you? And so I think that's part of the key.
Well, aren't there so many pieces of information that we're trying, and philosophies that we're trying to get in our heads and wrap our head around? Because then we also think about when Teddy Roosevelt wrote The Man in the Arena.
I don't know this one.
Well, it's just about the judgment of others, if I can paraphrase it. Okay. It's about, hey, you're the person in the arena actually doing it.
Yeah.
And so we actually have it in this other studio. And I think a lot of people, so you can go ahead, like Teddy Roosevelt, like, man, look at what he did for the parks and what he did for the country. And
yeah. And so look, the people, look, should you listen to other people for feedback? Of course you should. But should you allow the center of your soul to be like vulnerable to their potentially petty judgments? No, you should not. No, but I think you have to have a true north. I think part of what is the guardian against the false directions is if you have a true north, this is where I think tradition helps a lot, because Marcus Aurelius is true north. There's a lot of people that say, yeah, that true north is still north. I'm going to be a Stoic. I'm going to play that. I'm going to play by that playbook. So there are playbooks that are very, very reliable, and the established religions have playbooks that are very, very reliable. So I think locating yourself in a tradition, if you're not located in a tradition, then you have to invent everything yourself. Like people and by the way, there are people that will grow up in just terrible circumstances, and that's the hand they were dealt. But it's a very tough hand to play.
I'm going to read it. They brought it in for me.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
So it's The Man in the Arena. It says, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself into a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat."
Bing! Well, that's kind of what you're about. That's what we're all about, right? That's why we're on this podcast a little bit too. Yeah, it's like, I love that the athletics thing about leave it all out on the field. Yeah. And if you win, you win. Obviously you're not going to win every time.
Yeah. Do you think I don't like the word easier, because all the great things that I've been able to accomplish with groups of people in my life, they weren't easy in the moment. They were very uncomfortable. I think we use the word hard wrong. It's not usually physically hard. It's just massively uncomfortable. Do you think 2025, is it easier or harder? And let's put comfortable with easy and uncomfortable with hard. What is it versus previous generations?
Well, I think right now, I think the impact of social media on both adolescent life and personal life, as well as on our political polarization, neither of those are healthy. And the problem is we really don't know how to. We do not have a grasp on how to control, or not even control, how to manage social media. Not in the sense of passing laws, or not in that sense. How to just cope with social media in a powerful way. You can use it for good. That's very, very clear. But that's not what I'm thinking about. And so that, I think, is a big challenge that we're facing right now. We're facing a challenge where people lie, and it's okay, and it's like, but it's not okay. And so you say, well, but you don't know that, or I have alternative facts, or I have this or that. But there's a word from Eastern religion called karma. This is like, what goes around comes. Karma's gonna, and so I think we just have to be careful about saying, look, we need to be thoughtful about the karma we're creating, and be thoughtful about what we're doing. And you're not going to fix everything. You're not God, but you have to navigate a world where, there's a bunch of pressures in the world that are very challenging and unpleasant. And so those are just part of the game.
20 years ago, when I think I started, my mind started evolving. I'm here at 46 now, but late 20s going to 30. I started, it's just weird where it came. The story doesn't matter, but I turned on PBS and a guy named Wayne Dyer was there.
Okay. I don't think I remember Wayne.
About karma, and he talked about dharmas, and it was about meditation, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so he had moved to Hawaii, and how responsible, because what I took away from it was calming my mind, and I'm sure that's what's happening with meditation when you do that. But I'd like to hear what meditation's done for you. And it just seems, but at that moment, a lot of people would take this the wrong way. I realized, though, it was up to me.
Yeah.
I'm not being mean about it. I'm not being direct.
No. But nobody else can meditate. You remember that whole, though. I was raised in the Protestant tradition, but that thing about, you must walk this lonesome valley, you must walk it by yourself. Nobody else can walk it for you. I mean, there's a little bit of that. The meditation thing that's so nice. Meditation, this transcendental meditation stuff that I've been doing, it's stress releasing. And so what happens is, because you carry a lot of stress around, everybody carries a lot of stress around, and it's baggage. But if you meditate consistently, the stress gets kind of erodes away, and you're carrying less and less baggage with you as you're going along, which means your mind, you're more able to be present. And we all want to be in the moment, but let's face it, a lot of times it's hard to be in the moment. But particularly if you're carrying around a bunch of stress, because the stress has got you in your stress bag. So I think the thing that's powerful about meditation is it does help you get centered. Kind of helps you kind of get out of, whatever it is that's hanging you up at the moment. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a very powerful thing. And then you just get to bring your best self, which is not always the best, but your best self, what you got, whatever you got, to the table, which is kind of what we want, as we were saying. I think the ego wants to be able to do its very best as it can, kind of every time it gets on the field.
Who do you like being around the most?
Marie.
The type of person. Well, come on, you're not allowed to say that. Your wife.
We've only been married for 57 years, so we're still getting used to each other. But I'm thinking it's. I know. I mean,
the type of person, not the actual name, the type of person.
Yeah. I think people who are both ambitious and caring. So I like Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce. I spent a bunch of time with that team, so I'm delighted by him because he's very competitive, he's very ambitious, he's very demanding, but he also is deeply caring. So, and it's very authentic. I think authentic might be a word that I would want to use. So I like authentically grumpy people. I like anybody who's like it's like a curmudgeon. Yeah, if you're a authentic curmudgeon, not like yeah, I want to hang out with you.
Because there's something that can be funny and fun with those people.
It is. It is. And I have another friend who tells the most off-color jokes. I mean, honest to God, if anybody from HR ever heard of me be arrested, but he that's just what he does. It's authentic.
Isn't there something special about great friendships that you've built that context isn't required?
Yeah. We're gonna Marie and I have some friends, and we might not see them for 5 years, and you sit down and it's like, bing, and I think part of that is just it is trust, and it's not, and sometimes we think of trust as kind of like a passive or even like a superficial idea. It's just the opposite. I mean, trust is at some point you if you don't trust anyone, then you really are you're limited. So, and that's true in business too. Who can you trust and how can you be trustworthy? One of the things HP was my client for a very long time, and when I started my firm, and the thing I was most impressed with them was their trustworthiness. When somebody said something to you, it was you could trust them, and that was at a time. Remember, this is when most of tech was kind of a little bit, frankly, skating close to the edge of the truth. Not HP. That was not how they did it, and so and I think that trust was their biggest asset. And then they got kind of into a trust problem at the top, actually at the board level at the beginning of the century, and that was the beginning of spoiling a lot of things.
Do you think that happens because we're subservient to shareholders and the quarterly value? Is that why it happens?
I think in this case, there was a bunch of egos on the board. When the ego decides that it's the master, not the servant, you're now on a path that's not going to be very good.
I'd love to talk to you for another hour, but you have a hard stop. So here's what you have to give us. I love the conversation. Give us an overall wrap up to, if somebody hands you a mic for 30 seconds and they walk up to you and they're like, "Hey, Jeff, tell us what you got, man."
Well, I think for the entrepreneur, look, the world needs you. So I think every book I've ever written, I've said I wanted to put myself in service to a problem that I did not know the answer to, but that I felt was the problem to solve. And I thought I could probably find or figure out or work with other people to find it. But the thing people worry about was AI going to put me out of a job? The world is not going to run out of problems. The world has lots and lots and lots of problems, and it needs entrepreneurial intervention. And so I think, but it has to be a problem that you care about and that you think you have some sort of talent that would make progress against it. And then after that, just go.
Go find you on LinkedIn, right? You're all in there.
I am. Okay. Take care. Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure to talk with you.